Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently.
Sophie Vlogs.
I should really change this intro because I say regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently. Now I have such a backlog of these that you're probably not going to see this until 6 months after I filmed it. But hey, I'm just going to dive into it. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books to talk about this week. I'm going to start off with one that was utterly delightful and I loved every moment of it. That's The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy by Mackenzi Lee. This is the sequel to The Gentleman Guide to Vice and Virtue. This was lovely and fabulous, and Mackenzi Lee seems like she must be so much fun. This focuses on Felicity, who is the younger sister of the main character in The Gentleman's Guide, Monty. Felicity wants to be a doctor, but this is set at a time when women were not allowed to go to medical school or be doctors, and so what begins as her struggle to try and be taken seriously by the medical industry and to train to be a doctor morphs into this swashbuckling adventure which involves petticoats and piracy and many other fabulous things. These books are so much fun. They are light and frivolous, but also, like, they make some really valid points about, like, the worth of women and stuff. One thing I really liked about this is Felicity's attitudes towards femininity are challenged, which I thought was really good because Felicity has a tendency to look down on women who are more traditionally feminine, and someone calls her out on that at some point, which I thought was really good. I loved all of the topics which are explored, these topics of like naturalists and botanists, that sort of a thing is a vein in this as well as medicine. And piracy is kind of a thread in this, which is also really fun, because if you know me, I love me some pirate stories. There's also her relationship with Sim. I like it. It's very snarky, but I kind of really liked that. There was just some attempting to be spoiler-free thoughts on this, but suffice to say, if you are a fan of like YA historical romps, I would thoroughly recommend this series, absolutely. Continuing the YA thread, I also read Heir of Fire by Sarah J. Maas. This is the third book in the Throne of Glass series. I thoroughly am enjoying this series. I didn't enjoy this third book as much as the second book, maybe. Okay, essentially, I won't go too much into plot details because this is the third book in the series. What I will say is, this is a longer book than the other two by about 100 pages, and I found the plotting much slower. I think one of the things that I liked about the first two books is they were just like da 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 da, and here's another thing, and then another thing, and then another thing, and I quite liked that they were a little bit fast-paced and just like ha ha ha. This one at times I felt could have been edited down to be a little bit shorter. I have no problem with reading like a 500, 600 page book, that's not an issue, but it just at times dragged a little bit for me. There were a couple of new characters introduced as well who I didn't dislike them, but I am yet to be properly emotionally invested in them, whether that's Manon or Sorcha. I'm sure that to avoid spoilers, like with, for example, Manon, I'm sure there's going to be a point to her. I just currently am like, it's fine. No, just, actually I like Manon more than I like Sorcha. Sorcha, I just sort of like you exist, that's fine. Oh, I don't know if I'm being clear. Essentially, there are, again, I like where our ideas have continued on to. I'm still interested in this overarching plot line of what's going on. I just could have maybe done with a little tightening at the edges, a little tightening. But on the whole, will keep my eyes out for the fourth book. If I can get it secondhand and cheaper, that would be preferable. But yeah, enjoyed still. I just gave it 3 out of 5 stars, whereas I gave the second book 4 out of 5 stars because I thought the second half of the second book like kicked into gear a bit. And I think actually that's what it is. I always like the second half of these better than the first half of these because I feel like the first half is a bit like flur, 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 and then the second half we're like, okay, let's actually kick into gear and like get some plot lines resolved. So that's my feeling. The next two books sort of informed the reading of each other, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. So, the first one is The Mabinogian. This is translated by Sioned Davies. The Mabinogian is a collection of like Welsh folktales, essentially. They were not necessarily written by the same person, they're all just collected into this volume. I listened to an episode of In Our Time, which is a BBC4 radio show, which was talking all about the Mabinogian, and they always have guests on and they talk about it as a topic, and Sioned Davies was one of the guests, and she talked about the process of translating this from the original Welsh into English, and she was saying a lot that, like, prose translations, they just give you the story, but they don't give you the experience. And I'm a person who loves my oral storytelling, etc., like epics and this passing things down orally. There are rhythms that are present, there are repetitions which happen, and that's something that she really tried to preserve in this translation. And so even if it's sentences that in the original Welsh would be like alliterative or would have a certain rhythm to them, she's tried to retain that in the translation. So I really wanted to read this edition, and it was really lovely. As a result, you could really tell that this is something which really benefits from being read aloud. And there are all the things which might seem repetitious, which is like, and then blah, and then blah, and then blah, or whatever. These verbal repetitions are deliberate because it's all about the tradition of speaking like that. So this was really fabulous. This has got a lot of stories in it which I was familiar with, like the very basic story of, but which is nice to have read in their totality. The related book which I then read after is The Owl Service by Alan Garner. Yes, it is held together by a hairband because this is an old copy. I think this was originally my dad's, but I have such a memory of this book. It was always in the car, in like those little like pockets on the back of seats, and it used to live there. It's held together because it is falling apart, like quite literally, like it will just come apart in your hands. But The Owl Service is a retelling of the myth of Blodweth from the Mabinogian. So I read this a lot as a kid, and I've always been meaning to do a reread, but it was like that light bulb moment when I realised that this is based on the Mabinogian, and I just read the Mabinogian, so maybe this would be the perfect time to read The Owl Service. I really like this. It's, I'd say like, you know, urban fantasy, but except it's set in a rural Welsh village. Essentially, these three kids, the girl has holidayed on this farm for all of her life. She technically owns it. She has a stepbrother called Roger, who is sort of like an English new addition. This is the first time he's been to the farm. And then Gwyn, who is Welsh, whose mother grew up in the farm, but this is, again, his mother moved away, so this is the first time he's been there. They discover the owl service, which is a dinner service with owls on it. Alison starts tracing the pattern from the dinner service, and they make these owls, but then the pattern fades from the china, and essentially what happens is they've released this ancient, not like the spirits, almost like the spirits of the Tale of Blodweth, and it's enacting itself out through them, and it's like there's this implication that there's this cycle, that it's inevitable that every generation the tale will be enacted out again and again and again. And it's always, the Tale of Blodweth is that she's made from flowers to marry this guy, and then actually she falls in love with someone else, and they plot together and they try and kill him, and then he takes revenge and he throws a spear and kills the guy, and then Blodweth gets turned into an owl as punishment. And I cannot talk to you about the ending of this book because it would be a huge spoiler, but I really love how this ends, how it... Oh, I can't. But just this, as this goes on, it is acknowledged and discussed the ways in which, yes, what Blodweth did was in many ways a betrayal, but then also she was created out of flowers and she was never really given a choice. She was told she had to love this man, and can you really blame her for falling in love with someone else? As, you know, you can't create an autonomous being and then dictate to them how they have to feel. All of these things which are interesting things to discuss, because the Mabinogian in many ways is a product of its time and has some not great attitudes towards women a lot. So it's great to read a retelling which it's aimed at kids. This is like a kid's sort of urban fantasy book, but it does sort of acknowledge those little bits where it's like, not great, guys. So yeah, that was just a really lovely, it's always lovely when you reread something that you loved as a kid and you're like, this is still really good. Finally, I'm going to talk about a book which I absolutely loved. It's been a good book chat, guys. This is The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden, which is the second book in whatever this series is called that I always forget. I never actually posted my thoughts on The Girl and the Nightingale because The Bear and the Nightingale, sorry, because I just couldn't really articulate them very well. Suffice to say, this series is gorgeous, wintry, Russian folktale-y, delightful. The second book is a bit quicker pacing than the first book. I will say the first book very much took its time to get where it was going. I didn't mind that, but I know that some people were like, just get to the point already. This one does get into the action a little faster, I will say. I really enjoyed moving outside of the village this time and exploring a little bit more of the wider world that's going on. There was a lot to do with sort of like expectations on gender roles in this Russian society, which was interesting. There was also interesting hints about what might be coming in the third book, sorry, and Vassia's lineage, stuff like that. We get a little bit more explanation of some of her family background, which was cool. Yes, suffice to say, I don't want to go into spoilers, especially because it's the second book, so I'm trying to be vague, but I'm also trying to give across the fact that I love this. They're like these, I'm not necessarily ever rooting for any of the romance in these books, I will say that that's one thing, but there's like this sort of like fierce girl does fierce things type of thing, which I quite like. I'm glad that her sister Olga is present because, like the first book I just talked about, The Lady Goes to Petticoats and Piracy, occasionally there is a danger of Vassia being not like other girls, which I like when it's tempered by an acknowledgement that, like, actually girls can be feminine and do traditionally feminine things, and that's still absolutely fine. Just because that doesn't work for, like, a person doesn't mean it's bad entirely. So I'm hoping that the presence of Olga means that we'll get a little bit more of a balancing of that, because Vassia's very cool, and yes, Vassia doesn't want to be shut up in a building like the rest of the girls, but also, like, these girls are not bad because that's their lives. Does that make sense? That feels like a ramble. Those are all the books I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, have you read any of them? I would love to hear your thoughts on them. Otherwise, I'm going to call it a day there, and I will see you next week for something different.